next one that is indicated is Senator Mark Wall.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to welcome our guests today and just thank them for their advocacy and indeed help for older people. It's very much appreciated, and I know I've worked with many of them in the room today. I suppose a couple of issues. In the first issue, cliff edges have been mentioned a number of times from our earlier conversation and also in this conversation, and I come across that daily. It's been mentioned about the constituency office and people coming into us, and that's the same in my own office. But one of the issues that have come up, and maybe to get a comment on this, is the whole idea of gross income versus net income. And I've given the example to the department the last day they were in of a lady who unfortunately has been disqualified from fuel allowance because of her gross versus net income, and also not alone is she losing out on fuel allowance, but also losing out on secondary benefit like a warmer home scheme where she will not qualify as well. So I think it's wrong, and I'm sure our guests have come across that in their work over a period of time. In relation to the IQA, I've had both sides of the argument in the last week, would you believe. I've had one where there was a joint account and it disqualified the person, and then the other one where the person didn't actually want to go ahead with it until I explained that that they would qualify because they didn't have an account in their own name. The accounts were in their partner's name and they would actually qualify, and I actually met them yesterday and they actually got that payment. So that's the difference, and there is an argument there, I suppose, on both ways. One of the big issues that I've come across, and it's been mentioned by Alone just recently, is the whole back office area. Unfortunately, I've been dealing with a number of people who've had bereavements in the last couple of weeks. And in one recent engagement I've had to deal with up to 6 different departments for that person, be it pensions and be it other departments that their spouse were actually involved in. And that is very hard to do, I suppose, at that particular period of time. And also, I suppose, that the issue as regards means is that, the supplementary welfare is €5,000 and the funeral expense grant at the moment is done through the community welfare officer. So it's only €5,000 versus 20,000 in most other welfare payments. So that is a problem for people as well. So back office and consolidation needs to be looked at, in my opinion, because if we weren't available or yourselves weren't available, that person would be making 6 phone calls or 6 emails if they were able to do that. So I suppose, it's been said by others that this is a listening exercise. That is very much what we're doing today. But on a day-to-day basis, we come across older people who, from technology reasons, which has also been mentioned this morning, have to go to their local TD senators or public reps in order to get assistance. Consolidation for me is key to providing everybody what they're entitled to, and I think that's been mentioned a couple of times today. It's startling to hear that when government run ads that actually payments go up because people actually get to know what they're actually entitled to, and I think that's something that needs to be worked on, and maybe to get a comment on how we can improve that again, or do we need government, as I say, to consolidate. But look, just again to thank our contributors today for all the work that they've done, and maybe to get a comment on those means test limits, particularly on supplementary welfare, which is €5,000. When I get people sitting in front of me, it's the savings that they have for that rainy day, and unfortunately some of them are experiencing that rainy day. It is a very low amount of money, and it has been mentioned about the additional needs payments. I'm blue in the face talking about the amount of forms that have to be filled in, the amount of requirements for additional needs payments, even after the advertisement by government and the Minister when she was in with us previously. It is very hard for older people to come around and get all those documents that's needed for that together. But again, to thank you, and thank you, Chair, for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. So we might ask Age Action maybe to come in first.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the cliff edges, I mean, the obvious thing to do here is to bring in some kind of part payment or a tapering of welfare payments. Now, in the past, it was said, look, we had to keep the welfare system simple because it was paper-based initially. But now we have the IT systems that allow a good deal of individualisation of people's welfare payments. We're going to see that in the deferred pension. We're going to see it in the future with earnings-related top-ups, perhaps, to job seekers or to the pension. So it should be possible to simply work out mathematically, the extent to which someone is worse off because they're €1 or €2 over the income threshold, and make them a partial payment that makes sure that they're never worse off by missing that threshold. So cliff edges could be smoothed out, and I understand that we have the IT systems, or we're developing them, that would make that possible. In terms of bereavements, the Department of Social Protection is simplifying this by making an online system where you can register a bereavement, a death, and it'll indicate to all departments. Our concern with that is that many older people are not using the internet, and so are further at a disadvantage because they simply are not able to do that. And it means that the paper-based system also needs to be simplified to make sure that that process improves. In relation to the gross versus net income, there's a lot of different rules and eligibilities of what type of income is included or not included in different welfare payments. And that's something that's often not looked at, that certain types of income can be exempt or certain types of savings can be exempt, such as if you sell your family home to downsize, the extra savings you might have, it's exempt in some means tests, but not in others. And when it's not exempt, people can find that quite punitive. And there's always exceptions. I've one example of a woman who put money aside because her adult son has a disability, and to have money aside to provide for his care later in life. But there's no exemption for that in a means test. So it's counted as if she could liquidate that money and have it as an income. And there's lots of examples of that, of people want to save for their own expenses. They're afraid of future medical expenses. They might need to do all sorts of things to their homes for adaptability. And yet, the realistic range of costs they might face in terms of capital costs isn't really reflected in the means test thresholds and allowances.
Thank you. Mr. Moynihan?
Yeah.
Ms. Loughlin?
Yes, I'll turn on that. Thank you. So thanks for your questions. First of all, just in relation to additional needs payments and supplementary welfare, and in relation to means and savings, a significant proportion of older people we work with would have some savings set aside for their funeral costs. And often, because of those savings, their applications for additional welfare payments are rejected on that basis. That's something we've come across time and time again, despite the fact that in many cases these savings are relatively small. About half of older people living alone have savings of less than €8,100. It really is just that payment set aside for funeral costs, etc. So that's something that we would really like to see changed. In terms of access to community welfare officers as well was mentioned. We've seen over the last number of years it's getting more and more difficult to access community welfare officers, to get appointments, to get in touch, to get in contact, and to hear back then eventually as well. Additional welfare payments aren't means tested as such, but they do take into account your means and all of the various income you have. It's a very sliding scale. In some areas we work very closely with community welfare officers, elsewhere not the case. It really depends on the area. The second thing to say on the fuel allowance and SEAI grants, that's something that we've raised previously with the Department of the Environment, because the fuel allowance is a qualifying payment, the pension is not. The living alone allowance is not. This despite the fact that older people live in the oldest and the coldest homes and are most in need really of those fully funded grants. We work with many people who aren't eligible for the fuel allowance, or again just over that threshold, and then cannot access a grant for love nor money. We've recommended that the fully funded upgrades are made available to everyone in receipt of a state pension, but qualifying for the fuel allowance is really important in that. And like we say, lots of people weren't aware of the thresholds change in recent years, so they haven't applied for the fuel allowance, and it has knock-on effects then. In relation to the increase for qualified adults and the non-contributory pension, we raised Vera's story in the opening statement. In Vera's case, more than 60% of her husband's pension is being spent on nursing, her nursing home fees, which leaves her with very limited means for survival. She doesn't have access now to a non-contributory pension, a carer's pension, despite spending more than 20 years looking after her husband at home and receiving carer's benefits for the same. She raised a family of 7 children, but she's an anomaly in the system. She doesn't have access to whether the non-contributory pension, to the living alone allowance or others. So there's, as well as I suppose the difficulty when, whether it's choosing increased work qualified adult or non-contributory pension, some people don't have that choice because they're that anomaly in the system. So just to raise that issue as well. And finally, just on that centralisation of social welfare payments, again, the digital divide has been raised quite significantly, I think, already, and the ability to access. People are generally sent to mywelfare.ie now for any information relating to payments. We see ourselves, there's so many intermediary organisations, whether it's ourselves here today, whether it's the deputies and senators here providing information, whether it's citizens information, whether it's any of those other organisations that provide information on the entitlements that people should be able to access. There's an awful lot of manpower going into this, and yet somehow we haven't yet, and we're delighted to see that there will be some look at consolidating and really streamlining those means tests. How much money could be saved, how much time could be saved and spent on all of our jobs and all of the work that all of the organisations have to do if it was easier to access the payments to begin with.
Thank you. And the Senior Citizen Parliament.
I couldn't have said that better myself, Grania. To add to that, in relation to citizens' information, I think last year they put in a submission and even they referenced the fact that the pension system is so complex that they struggle to figure out what the certain pensioner needs or the entitlements that they are indeed entitled to. And in relation to means testing limits, supplementary welfare, and being means tested on your savings, a lot of people, because of the thresholds not going up in line with inflation, because of the little pension increase of €12 a week, it does disqualify a lot of people. So they found that they were taking the fuel allowance and a lot of fuel allowance and a lot of welfare payments were taken off them because of that.
Yeah, very briefly.
Very briefly, Deputy Wall, I just came from a previous joint committee, but one of the issues that came up in that was in where a couple where one member, the male at 66 years of age, had come across serious health issues and couldn't work. The only thing, a pension that he could access was non-contributory, but because of his spouse's employment and the payments he couldn't get anything. And the suggestion was basically if his spouse gave up work, that he would be entitled to a non-contributory pension. And I mean, it's discriminatory in its simplest form. Like, I mean, you know, we want equality and all that. Like, and that's one of the issues too. That means tested by your spouse or your partner or your husband, wife, or cohabitant. You know, that in that respect has to be looked at.